Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. So what's new and exciting in your world this weekend? He asked, again, hoping against hope.
I ran across some news about a startup in Seattle called Pembient. They're developing a solution to rhino poaching problems by 3D printing rhino horns that are, according to them, indistinguishable right down to the DNA from the real thing. Their intent here is to mass produce these things, flood the market with them, thereby driving the price of rhino horn down so low that it's no longer profitable for poachers to poach.
So I got a question here, and I honestly don't know the answer. What do people want rhino horns for anyway?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure that they're used in some Chinese medicine. Beyond that, I don't know.
I bet that's right.
But there's an interesting lesson here. And I think it's one that people are starting to realize with respect to both the economy and the environment. And it's the same thing in both cases. When you try and work against the system, be it the ecological system or the economic system, you're doomed to failure because the system is just too complex and it's way bigger than any government entity. The right way to handle these things is to work with the system, to understand how the system's going to respond. So you have a beautiful example here in our friend Howie Bacher's book, Free Our Markets, which you should all go out and buy after you have bought our book. In Free Our Markets, Howie talks about elephant poaching in Zaire and Zimbabwe and how these two countries dealt with elephant poaching. The one tried to stand athwart the laws of economics by outlawing elephant poaching. The other one tried to work with the laws of economics by not making it illegal, in fact, establishing property rights. And what happened was villagers got together and they ended up raising elephants. And the long and short of the story is, over the course of the subsequent decade, in the country that banned the elephant poaching, specifically the trade in ivory, the elephant populations were decimated. In the country that allowed the trade in ivory, the elephant populations grew. And what happened? Well, the country worked with the laws of economics, gave people a profit incentive to raise and protect the elephants, and that's what happened. You got more elephants. And so too here. You've got this company working with the laws of economics. You don't ban the rhino horn market. All that does is to raise the price of the thing and make it more profitable to poach.
I always tell young people that if they really want to make sure the spotted owl does not go extinct, you should find a place on the McDonald's menu for it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. We have no shortage of cows. We have no shortage of Christmas trees because there are markets for both of these things. What do we have a shortage for? Everything that's outlawed.
That's exactly right. And anybody who doubts this, just take a look at the drug market in your town.
Yeah.
As soon as you move to a regime that takes the danger out of that sort of thing, there's much less crime. I mean, much less. So I don't understand why people keep missing this, but miss it they always do.
This goes back to the idea of the economy as a complex thing, and it might feel really good to pass a law saying, thou shalt not kill rhinos. Okay, fine, but all you've done is you made yourself feel good. You haven't achieved the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah, and the beauty of it is that nobody ever goes back to assess how well the program worked.
No, right. Everybody just pats themselves on the back and moves along to the next thing.
We did a great thing. Of course, rhino parts are illegal now. Hooray.
Right.
And meanwhile, there's literally no difference on the ground. If anything, it makes it worse. With that, Ann, I want to get to what I think might be the coolest, funniest thing to happen in a while. El Salvador is bringing on Bitcoin as an official state currency.
Oh, no, I didn't see that at all.
Yeah, and I got to think this runs the risk of changing everything. You got to be a little careful here because El Salvador doesn't really have its own currency anyway. They've been using the U.S. currency since, 2001, something they call the Law of Monetary Integration, which ends up allowing circulation of the U.S. dollar in a fixed exchange rate of 8.75 colones. The colon is still legal tender, but nobody uses it. It's like it doesn't even exist.
Sure.
So they moved to the dollar that way, and now they're going to add a crypto to the dollar. So in a lot of ways, what we're seeing here is, I think, a slap at the dollar. People are a little concerned about using that as their own currency. So here we are with El Salvador entering with an exit strategy.
And this goes back to what you and I have been talking about for at least a year with regard to this MMT nonsense, modern monetary theory. The argument that the MMT proponents make is, well, you could go ahead and print as many dollars as you want because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Well, it's not the world's reserve currency by law. It's the world's reserve currency because so far it's been pretty stable. And we argued that if we start printing money, the dollar is going to lose value and countries are going to look to a different reserve. And here we have El Salvador as example number one.
And a pretty compelling reason to go back and take a look at Bitcoin and see what you think about it.
Right.
This may be the kind of thing that changes your opinion. Now, El Salvador is almost entirely a cash economy. There are some hurdles here, and you and I both know that it's difficult in the best of circumstances to use Bitcoin as a currency. All of this is stipulated. Nonetheless, this becomes a hash mark on the other side of the equation.
Yeah, you start to wonder if we're going to see a raft of developing countries doing the same thing. I mean, they might as well. You've got a bunch of countries that are just pegged to the dollar as is. Why not peg to something else?
And I think that's exactly right. And not only that, but it absolves you of the responsibility of running a monetary system.
Yeah.
Think about the intense use of resources when you start getting that far into the weeds. I think we're going to see a lot more of this.
And you get something else when you aren't printing your own currency. You get a much more limited government because
that is correct.
By definition, the government is limited to how much it can tax, and people are only going to stand so much of that.
Yeah, near as I can tell, about 20%, right? This is where the number we come back to year after year after year. It'd be nice if somebody would finally listen. Anyway, I think this is going to be a very fascinating couple of years. I'm going to keep a closer eye on El Salvador.
I started investing in Bitcoin back in, good Lord, 2012, when the price was around $200.
You could have been really wealthy.
Yeah, well, I ended up getting out at the 10,000 mark. My point is, it went up to whatever it went up to 60,000 and then crashed down to wherever it is now, around 35. But I've decided about 2 weeks ago, I'm getting back in.
Well, yeah. And anybody out there who wants to, hand over some Bitcoin, I'll put up a link for you anytime you like.
Absolutely.
But I think it's probably wise to give it a longer, harder look. I don't want to be accused of giving anybody financial advice. We are not doing that. I'm not qualified. You're not qualified. But it's interesting, the things that are going on right now.
Yeah.
But of course, Ant, we run the risk of not getting to the foolishness of the week if we talk about this anymore. This is actually a strange thing. Ant and I both agreed that this was a story we needed to talk about today. So I prevailed upon him to hold off on it so I could give it to you as the foolishness of the week. Italian artist Salvador Garau has just sold an invisible sculpture for $18,000 US. What the ever-loving, what the hell is wrong with everybody? This guy, apparently a legitimate artist, made an invisible sculpture. Last I checked, that was nothing. How does this keep happening? Why are people so dumb? And I want to remind everybody, back in 2014, that there was a canvas by Robert Ryman that got $15 million at auction. It was blank. He didn't paint anything on it. He went down to the store, he said, give me that canvas. He brought it up and he sold it for $15 million. Now, if you're dumb enough to buy one of these things, a $15 million blank painting, an $18,000 non-existent sculpture, I don't know what the hell's wrong with you. I really don't. I mean, for God's sake, drop me a line and I will make you any of these sorts of great artworks for half the price.
The artist, Salvador Garau, made all manner of noise about how the sculpture represents space full of energy, and he references the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I suspect the only thing the sculpture represents is the extent to which so-called artists bilk so-called intellectuals out of their money.
I got to hand it to Salvador Garau. He has stumbled headlong into a very lucrative business that will require almost nothing of him. But my God, what the hell's wrong with all these people?
I don't think he's thought this through, because I can prove that he actually stole the piece from me. I have pictures. I have pictures from throughout my life in which I appear with the sculpture.
Next to it, sometimes with other friends in foreign countries.
Right. The whole nonsense actually gave me an idea for a new podcast. We'll call it Silence and Enumerance. For a mere $5 per week, James and I will send you a recording of 30 minutes of silence, during which you will be alone with your thoughts, most of which are likely more interesting than what James has to say anyway.
Up yours. Just up yours. What's wrong with you? Look how pleased you are with yourself for that little tiny ding you just took out of me. You're as bad as all these other people we're talking about today.
No, stop and think about that for a moment. Suppose we started a podcast that was just silence. Don't just put it out there. You charge like $500 a week as a subscription. How many people are going to want to be snooty enough to pay for it?
Well, probably none, because none of them are listening as it is. But hey, who knows? I just can't help but think that this is the Emperor's new artwork.
Well, I read some fine print that went along with this, and supposedly what you get, or what the buyer got when he bought this thing, is a certificate of authenticity along with instructions that he's supposed to display the work in a 5-foot square empty space.
And must be displayed in a private space free from obstructions, where lighting and climate control are not required. Yeah, come to find out, you don't have to really take any concern about how hot or cold it is. Humidity, probably never going to present a problem to this piece of art. I don't even know what to say about this. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And if you are out there listening and you have fallen victim to this charlatan, give us a call. We would love to interview you about the process here.
To support James and Ant as we do what we do, please wander over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where, for less than a membership to that fitness center you know you won't use, we'll be happy to send you a weekly message assuring you that you look great just the way you are. Michael Huemer received his BA from UC Berkeley and PhD from Rutgers University, and is currently professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He is the author of more than 70 academic articles in ethics, epistemology, political philosophy, and metaphysics, as well as 8 brilliant and amazing books that you should immediately buy, including The Problem of Political Authority, Dialogues on Ethical Vegetarianism, and Knowledge, Reality, and Value. Links to all of which you can find in the show notes. Mike, welcome to Words and Numbers. This is a conversation I've been wanting to have. I shouldn't say have, because I'm going to be more an observer here, for a long time. When I met James, I was a staunch anarchist, and we would argue back and forth about anarchy until one day I came to the realization that throughout human history, every time humans get together, government emerges, which makes me wonder, is government itself an emergent phenomenon? That made me, of course, very sad, because as an economist, I've got to take that seriously. On the other hand, I still maintain hope that when humanity becomes adult enough, we can handle true anarchy. So I have asked you on to Words and Numbers to defend anarchy. James is going to have nothing of that.
Well, I don't think that's exactly right. I think in a perfect world with perfect people, it would be my perfect option.
Yeah.
But in the imperfect world with all these imperfect people, now I wonder. But I'm interested to hear what Mike's got to say about it. You're probably the highest profile anarchist we've ever had on. I want to hear what you've got to say about these sorts of things. And I'm sure Ant's going to have lots and lots of follow-up questions. So the floor is yours. Tell us about anarchism, the whys and the hows.
First, I want to put in a plug for my book, The Problem of Political Authority. If you want to know about the theory, you actually just have to read a book by an anarchist, especially me. And the reason I say that is it's too big of a topic. Everybody can think of about a dozen objections. In the book, I tried to respond to every objection I could think of. But if I don't respond to your favorite objection, then the listener is going to say, aha, he can't answer this. When I wrote the book, I wasn't just talking off the top of my head. So why am I an anarchist? I guess the way I think of it is there are 2 ways of providing the goods that we want government to provide. You could provide it coercively or voluntarily. The government method is coercive and monopolistic. The anarchist method is voluntary, and voluntary exchange is better than coerced exchange, and you probably know why that's true also. And you probably agree with that for almost all goods and services, but it's just that most people don't agree with it for a few goods, which happen to be provided by the state. But I think the same reasons actually apply, like protection from criminals. That's a service, could be provided by a monopoly, and exactly the same thing is going to happen to that monopoly that happens with every other monopoly on an important product. It's going to be overpriced, it's going to be low quality, it's going to be short supply. And that's the basic reason, right?
And yet, empirically, we can look at history and see that governments keep emerging.
Yeah.
If indeed this is not the optimal solution, how come it keeps presenting itself?
You have to distinguish between institutions that have survival value and the institutions that are actually beneficial, right? Institutions and practices could last because they promote themselves, but not because they promote the interests of human beings or society. The fact that it happens a lot doesn't show that it's good. It could just be that it's good for the people who are imposing it on everyone else.
And I think that's actually the likely outcome. I don't see a reason that I would say, oh, hooray, government, we need to do this because it will make us all so much better off.
Yeah.
But we always seem to get it, which means that somebody's got the corner on power somewhere, and it always seems to manifest. And I don't see a way that we can fix it so it doesn't.
I would remind you that there have been times in history when people could have said something similar. So when the United States was founded, people could have said, we've never had democracy, or it was tried briefly in ancient Greece and it didn't work out. So obviously democracy doesn't work. And that wouldn't have been a dumb thing to say either. It would have been plausible at the time, but just wouldn't have been true. Also, most societies have had slavery. We used to have oppression of women.
Sure. And it's interesting with the American founding example that you started with, because I think that's exactly right. There was no reason that they had to choose this over that. And they could have easily said, well, our problem is really a representational problem and the king isn't helping. We'll just get a new and better king. And that was never really a possibility. That was just not on the table. So from that perspective, you're offering something that sounds like, well, okay, maybe not now, but maybe this is the kind of thing we evolve into over time. You think maybe that's the correct answer?
Yeah, basically. What changes over time? A few things, but I think one thing is that people's values change over time, and that could be important. What we've seen over the course of history is there's a lot less violence over the course of history, partly because people's values have shifted to thinking that violence is a lot less easily justified. The interesting anecdote is in early America, Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president, has a duel with the ex-Treasury Secretary because the vice president said, you are a shitty Treasury Secretary. So now one of them has to kill the other. Okay. And that doesn't happen today. It's just like the whole society regards it as a completely ridiculous thing to do. Belief in the dignity of the individual is becoming more popular. That might make a difference to how well social systems work out. And at some point you realize that government is not consistent with modern values. Like you talk about the value of equality, government is the biggest offense to that. The idea of government is, let's have this group of people who are above everybody else. They get to do stuff that would be a rights violation to everyone else. And when you think about the badness of coercion that we were just talking about, government is founded on coercion. Why do they get to kidnap people and lock them in cages? There's been a shift in values over the course of history. When you think about the values that we're moving towards, they're not compatible with government.
It's interesting to think of it that way, because one way to interpret what we're seeing is through the lens of a market, that as people's tastes change, businesses have to evolve, and you shift from producing this product that people no longer want to producing this other product that now people do want. And perhaps it's coincident, but it's interesting that at the same period that our values are shifting such that we're less tolerant of violence, governments in the developed world are shifting away from producing violence to producing welfare.
It's even more interesting than that, though, because Ant and I go to high schools all the time and we meet young people, which, unless you're out there meeting them all the time, you really don't get a sense of what their lives are like and what they think is appropriate. And one thing that we've absolutely seen, without any question whatsoever, is that people at root level are becoming far less violent in their day-to-day lives, to the point now where most high school students, not only have they not had a fight, they've never seen one. Mm-hmm. Isn't that something? Given my high school experience, I never would have predicted such a thing. And yet here we are. Those kids grow up, they do 4 years in college, they get to be in their early 30s, and they have more influence. And you can see how things do, in fact, change over time generationally. And it's going to be, I think, with them and violence, a very big sea change.
What Anthony said made it sound maybe the government is acting like a business that wants to provide their customers what the customers want. But then why would they do that? Because they have a monopoly and they're just forcing everyone to give them money, so they don't. But the thing is, the government is staffed by people. And if the values of people in general are changing, then the values of the people in the government are going to be changing too.
I was amiss here we should have done this at the beginning of this segment, but there'll be some of our listeners who equate anarchy with chaos. Can you take a minute to underline that anarchy is not chaos and what the difference is?
Yeah. Anarchy is not chaos.
Well said.
I guess there's a colloquial use of anarchy that means something like total chaos, but there are no social theorists who think the ideal society is just anybody does anything at any time with no rules. I don't think that. I don't know anyone who thinks that. The idea of the anarcho-capitalist is you could provide order without a central authority structure. You could have spontaneous order. It's not that you should have no laws, it's that laws could arise from the community, so to speak, in the way that the common law arose. It used to be that most of our law was common law rather than statutory law, which means basically it arose from decisions that judges made, and then judges looking at what other judges had said in similar cases when they wanted to decide a case, sort of like a tradition that arises without any particular person laying it down. The way that the laws could be enforced is, well, they could be enforced by competing protection agencies rather than by a single monopolistic protection agency. The cops are a monopolistic protection agency. They're supposed to protect you, and they exclude anyone else from doing their job. So if you try to set up a police station and do the cop's job, government cops will come and shut you down. What anarchists want is they still want there to be guards patrolling to catch criminals and so on, but they just don't want it to be a monopoly. They want there to be competing agencies that you could choose to hire.
How do you deal with the criticism that, okay, you'll have these competing police bodies, the rich people can get together and they can hire big, large numbers of police bodies with better equipment and so forth, and they can in effect impose their will on the rest of us?
It strikes me as a weird and unrealistic worry. Rich people are going to be the criminals, and they're going to be hiring security agencies to help them commit crimes. They will hire security agencies to protect their stuff, and they will get better quality protection. It will be hard to steal rich people's stuff because they will have good security guards. That's likely to happen. But do you know any rich people who are big-time criminals? Not white-collar criminals. They might be white-collar criminals, but you know any who are going around robbing people in the streets and stuff like that?
No.
No, it's the poor people who'd be robbing people because they have a reason to do it. Part of the reason why rich people are not going to be going around trying to rob people or whatever is they're already rich. Why are they going to be robbing the poor people? The poor people should be robbing them because they're the ones with money. When the rich person wants something that the poor person has, they could just buy it. And that's going to be easier and cheaper than paying a third party to try to force the poor person to give it to them. Right? If you want people to work for you, you could say, oh, I'm going to hire a bunch of armed guards to go kidnap people and enslave them. Or you could just pay people to do the work. And the second thing is going to be easier and cheaper, right?
Anthony's favorite example, I think, plays here, so I'll steal it from you a little bit. When he talks about police officers, and I've seen him say this at least in 10 different presentations, and people are always a little shocked. He always talks about the Duquesne police. Duquesne does not have town police protection, so the Pittsburgh police don't mess around with the campus the Duquesne police do. And they've got a customer service model that they deal with, so of course their behaviors are radically different. They are helpful, and they're kind, and when students pass out drunk face down on a sidewalk, they help them up and bring them home, and these sorts of things. And then you think, okay, I understand that. Town police are going to be much more problematic than campus police. But then again, another observation comes and you think, okay, the sheriff's office, not universally, but generally speaking, quite easy to deal with because they have to face the voters from time to time. And they too end up with a customer service model. So all of a sudden, people who don't think anarchy is reasonable when presented with some options where you can see exactly how it's going to play out, all of a sudden see some more reason to it than they might have previously. And in this exact example of law enforcement, that's where most people interact with their government. So there you go.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting how we accept completely different answers without tracing them out to their logical conclusions.
These are good examples. One of the things this is showing is large organizations get to be worse. Like a small police department for a small area where they interact regularly, they might interact with the same people, they're going to behave better than a police department that's like the FBI coming around and they're from Washington. They don't know any of the people in this town. Another thing I was going to say is you hear these stories about police brutality. You hear about the police shooting people that probably shouldn't be shot. Do you ever hear any stories about security guard brutality? The private security guard that somebody hired to protect their building just going off and shooting somebody, right? Somebody who hadn't done anything and didn't have a weapon or whatever. All they did was they were selling untaxed cigarettes, like the guard.
Or if you do hear it, it's followed by, and the guy went to jail.
Yeah, that's what we're having. That's why they hardly ever do it, because they don't think that they have a license to do whatever. Why did the police get away with a lot more? Because they work for the government and the government makes the rules. There's one organization that makes all the rules, then they're just going to make the rules to favor themselves. But if you have a security guard company that tries to get away with that kind of crap, they're going to get fired. And somebody's just going to hire another security guard company that does a better job.
So how would you deal with an environmental example? So I'm a rich guy and I acquire this plot of land that has minerals or what have you. It's far away from me, so I don't care. And in an anarchic situation, it's cheaper for me just to level the land and pull out the resources I want and not care about preserving the environment. How do you deal with that in the framework of anarchy?
You should worry about the pollution. You put pollution into the air or the water. If the pollution is relatively localized, then there could be a specific victim who would complain about it, and then they could file a lawsuit against you. And of course, because this is anarchy, it would be a lawsuit in a private court. Again, we anarchists are not saying there shouldn't be any law and order, whatever. We're just saying that it should be competitive rather than monopolized. So there'd be a system of competing arbitrators. Your neighbor says, look, I don't like the pollution coming onto my land. And then you and the neighbor work out what arbitrator you're going to go to. And if you either refuse to go to arbitration or you violate the arbitrator's decision, then, that's when your neighbor calls their security company to enforce the decision.
This is interesting because you're giving this counter, and what's coming to mind is an experience I had just a year ago regarding COVID. And that is I had purchased an airline ticket in Spain through Spain's airline. Because of the COVID thing, everything got shut down and I need to get my money back. And the airline says that it has a policy that it'll give you your money back, but they weren't doing it. And I'm getting to run around and talk to humans. There's no way to do it online and nobody speaks English, or I'm sure they do speak English, but they're not going to speak English to me, right? They're doing everything they can to make it difficult so that I go away. So what did I do? I called up American Express because I bought it with my American Express card and explained the situation. And they said, no problem, we'll refund your money. I'll get my money back. And I don't know what they did with the airline on their end, but here it is, a private entity acting in the same way you're describing, like an arbitrator. I present my case and they say, yeah, you're right. And they handle it.
In fact, that might be the way that most disputes would get resolved. Through this third-party company that handles the payments. I believe that what happens is the company actually hasn't gotten their money yet. So your credit card got charged, and I think American Express takes a month or 3 months or so. They take a long time to actually get the money. So they don't have to get the money back.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The company could say, well, we're not going to take American Express anymore, but then they're going to get fewer customers, right?
Right.
And every credit card company does this. This is a good bit of advice for listeners who don't know this. I think a lot of people don't know this. If you have a problem with a service, within 30 days or something, you can complain to the credit card company and get the money back. And the credit card company is going to be more sympathetic than the company that you bought from.
It's beautiful. There's anarchy in operation right there. And we don't think of it.
Imagine using the state's remedy to the airline. That's going to cost you many times more than the ticket and a lot more time, too.
The real damning characteristic of all politics is that we learn to lower our sights so completely, given the cost of keeping them at all high, that we all learn to just go along to get along. Nothing improves as a result in that entire space where government operates. We're still suffering with the same problems that our grandfathers suffered. And that's really damning if you think about it.
A lot of cases worse, right?
Yeah.
The legal system, I guess people just accept that it's like a fact of nature that legal services have to cost hundreds of dollars an hour. It has to cost thousands of dollars to resolve a dispute, and it has to take months to years to resolve it. Oh, I guess that's just the way that it works. You notice that that's what happens with government services when the government is providing a product. It gets like super slow and expensive and not that great quality either.
My guess is that every single person who listens to this podcast has just become a fan of Michael Huemer. I honestly expect that that's exactly what's been happening.
Something of a side point. I think the reason why legal services are super expensive is largely a matter of deliberate government policy to make it more expensive.
Right.
And I think a large part of the reason for that is that lawyers basically run the government.
Right.
The vast majority of legislators are lawyers. The president is usually a lawyer. Is Joe Biden a lawyer? I think he is.
Yeah, he plagiarized his way through law school, actually.
And 100% of the judicial branch are lawyers, right? So all three branches of government.
Yeah, it's majority lawyer in each branch. So here's the obvious question for you, or at least an obvious question. We'll get to the brass tacks kind of thing in a second. But how is it that you manage to remain hopeful and good-natured? You don't seem like you're a bitter man who walks around shaking his fists in the air. Because clearly, if we're moving towards your preferred outcomes, it's a slow move at best. How do you remain optimistic about these sorts of things?
You remind yourself of what things were like 1,000 years ago, you start to feel better. In ancient Greece, when they were like forcing slaves to fight to the death for entertainment, and they'd be like, oh, that's so funny, he got his arm dropped off. And so if you compare the present day to that, it seems like we're doing really great. Actually, if you compare the U.S. to most other countries in the world, you just feel like you're doing great. There's a lot of stuff that's screwed up, and 500,000 people are in jail unjustly because they just want to use recreational drugs. I would be really unhappy if I was a drug user.
The question that's always given to anarchists, who will build the roads?
Yeah. There's a discussion of this by Brian Kaplan where he's basically talking about how you have to privatize the roads. He was proposing that you have to give an equal share of ownership of the roads to every current citizen. But how do we build new roads? How do we maintain the roads? For long distances, I think there would be toll roads. Fortunately, now you can collect money in a very efficient way. You could just have a transponder in your car and they can automatically charge you. So that's okay. For short distances within a neighborhood or within a business district, there would probably be local property owners associations that would pay for maintenance of the roads. And they would do that because if you're a resident, you want to be able to get to your house. You're a business owner, you want people to get to your business.
I've lived in a couple of places where the roads were private and the local neighborhood maintained it. There were no tolls or anything like that. It was just every once in a while, and you were expecting it. You'd get a bill. It's your share of the upkeep or whatever it is. And they were actually the best maintained roads I've ever encountered.
And look, this question of roads is a pain in the ass question, right? It's designed to be a pain in the ass question. And isn't it interesting that Mike brings up transponders in the car, which we almost all already have anyway, right, for all kinds of reasons. Technology seems to be wiping the slate clear on this. I'm interested to see where this goes in the next 20 years.
Related to our earlier question about what has changed that would make anarchy work better. Partly, technology is making it easier. It would have been harder. The toll roads would have been harder, and it wouldn't have been so attractive 50 years ago.
That's right. There's any number of ways that you can set these sorts of things up in a passive way, that you don't really have to be all involved in it in the management of the thing every minute of every day. So maybe as technology improves, even if we don't get to some sort of anarchic paradise, we can get to some place that's at least better.
I think it would be really hard to get most people to anarchism, but if you don't want to go all the way to anarchism, just think about how it could be nice to get closer to anarchy. My proposal of privatizing the police, but suppose the government just starts outsourcing their policing duties. They start having private security guard companies, and there are different competing private security guard companies, and different neighborhoods get to pick who patrols their neighborhood. And then for the court system, imagine that the government just starts outsourcing that as well. So people come to the government and they say, hey, I want to file a lawsuit. And the government says, well, here's a list of arbitrators. And so you can imagine the whole court system shrinking and the number of cases they take going down. You could get pretty close. This isn't anarchy yet, but it's getting closer. And that doesn't seem like that would be a disaster, right? What's wrong with that?
Mike, thanks for coming. It's been an interesting half hour. Anything you want our listeners to take away from this? If they're going to remember one thing and maybe even act on it, what would you have them act on?
There's not that much for individuals to do, but I would suggest reading more about the subject. to just reading my book. There's also David Friedman's great book, Machinery of Freedom, and Murray Rothbard's book, For New Liberty. I think that people just listening to me talk for half an hour is not enough to make you an anarchist. It shouldn't be enough. But I'm hoping that it's enough to make people want to read more about it.
Sure. And as we said earlier, a link to Mike's book is in the show notes, and you should absolutely click through and have a look. Mike, thanks for coming today.
This has been great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for having me.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers, but you be sure to join us next week when we have something even more titillating than this week's offerings. Follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Go ahead and do your stupid thing now.
What's that, James?
The email address.
Do we have email?
And that's all the time we've got this week.
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah, that's good. And between now and then, you might consider dropping in on Words and Numbers Backstage on the Facebook group we've got, where the conversation continues.
Oh, and we should say something about your video series, Smokin' Stories, which you can find on YouTube.
You can. We might even put a link to my YouTube channel here for you.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll put a link in the show notes.
We could probably do that.
It's actually really good. You've got, 3 episodes, another one coming out today, is that right? Or maybe your third one's coming out today.
Third one comes out today, that's right.
Yeah.
And I've gotten a couple of messages already, so it might be out. People tell me that they're considering taking up smoking because of these videos.
My mother ran across it because I put the audio version in the Saturday bonus episode last week, and she just listened to a couple of minutes of it and said, "What is that business, smoking something?" And I said, "Oh, that's James Smoking Stories." And she asked, "Well, what's the smoke part?" And I said, "Well, James is a pipe aficionado and talks about these sorts of things." And she said, "Oh, I'm not interested in any of that." I said, No. That's just kind of in the background. Go and listen to the stories because they're really good. So I think you might have another fan now.
Excellent. She's been paying me all these years to be your friend. It might as well work out this way.
She's not paying you enough, James.
Oh, don't I know it? It's one of those labors of love that we do. Poor mothers of economists' sons. What can you say? Anyway, I'll catch you next week. Take it easy.
See you next week, James.